morning, everyone. Good to see you. I think March break and time change is like the lethal combination for churches, and especially churches where there's so many young people who are like, oh, they were probably doing lots of stuff last night. So for the faithful few who are here, you guys are awesome. It's great to see you. I think this is a really good week. I'm really excited to have this conversation, but let me just set it up first. So I'm not sure kind of what family structure, what your family growing up was like. So in my family, church was really important. I've shared some stories about my family before, but Sunday was like a really important day, and I didn't always know why when I was little. So we'd go to church for sure, and it was one of those churches where you'd go early for Sunday school, and then you'd have Sunday school, and then you'd have kind of the morning church service. So you had like a double whammy. And then my dad was the pastor, so we'd hang out till everything got cleaned up. And then by the time we got home, you know, as a kid, like you're just ready to play and run and, you know, just let all your energy out. But we'd go home and we'd always have this like, my parents were big on this like Sunday dinner, so there'd always be like a roast or something. So you'd have this semi-formal dinner every Sunday, and then they had this rule that you couldn't really go outside and play. I never understood what was going on there, other than we were supposed to kind of stay calm. And then as we would keep complaining, then eventually my brothers and I could push it to the point where we would be able to go outside and shoot like hoops at our basketball net, but no friends could come over. And then over, you know, time, eventually friends could come, but you couldn't leave. You had to stay like at our house. And then eventually that would stretch where you could maybe ride your bike, but stay around. It was like all these crazy things that I had no idea what was going on, other than there's something about Sunday and something about that idea of keeping it special or different that was important to my parents, but it never translated to us as kids. It just felt like you can do this on Saturday, but on Sunday you can't. And it was just this really weird thing going back. And then when I think about it now, I'm like, now I understand what they're trying to do. They're trying to teach us and model this rhythm of Sabbath, of what it means to have a rest and a break. But as a kid, when you're like 12 and you're like told you can't go and do anything, you just need to either stay in your room or maybe just play a board game, and it's like beautiful and sunny and 20 degrees outside, it makes zero sense. And that's all I really remember about the Sunday, about like keeping it special, was that we couldn't do anything or have any fun, and it just made no sense to me. And as we've been going through this series, talking about spiritual disciplines as a church, talking about Sabbath was one that I knew was going to be really important for us, and something I'm really excited to have. And so a number of weeks ago, we were supposed to have this conversation. It was the week where we canceled meeting because they had that freezing rain advisory, which I'm not sure. I think we got freezing rain later in the day, but we probably could have done the Sunday morning. And so we canceled, and my friend Matt was going to come that day and share with us because Sabbath and Sabbath keeping has been something that's been an important part of their community and their rhythm for a while. So I was so excited to have Matt come and join us, and then we canceled the Saturday night. But Matt was so gracious to come back and join us. And so I want to bring Matt up. We're going to have a conversation, and Matt's going to teach us a little bit of what they've been learning about Sabbath. So can we give a rousing March break welcome to Matt Pamplin? I don't know if you want that, and you can use that mic. So just by way of introduction, Matt is the pastor of a church in Hamilton called St. Clair Community Church. And I think I met Matt, I was trying to remember, I think it was 2002, potentially.
Long time ago.
So Matt, you'll see, has an accent, and he's from somewhere else. And I was working at a church as a youth pastor, and then Matt showed up one Sunday. Were you and Jen married then, or dating?
Married.
Oh, married.
That's
Okay.
why I moved here.
So he married a Canadian girl, and I remember Matt and his wife Jen, newly married Matt and Jen, showed up to the church where I was a youth pastor, and we became friends kind of right away, and then Matt became like a volunteer youth leader, which was hilarious.
You and I looking back.
Lots of stories, lots of trouble. But Matt's been a good friend for a lot of years, and Matt's been leading his church in St. Clair. It was a church plant that started how long ago, Matt?
Probably about 5 years ago we started praying, and then about 3 and a bit we started our Sunday gatherings.
Right. And the conversation on Sabbath has been something that's been an important part of formation, community formation and spiritual formation for them as a church. So when I knew this was coming up, Matt was on our list to say, I want to make sure I have Matt come and lead us. Matt's like one of the best pastors I know. I feel like I'd have so much to learn from Matt, and we have lots of jokes back and forth, but he's a regular encouragement and good friend for me. So anyways, let's just get to know you a little bit and then jump into Sabbath. So how would you introduce yourself? Just tell us a little bit about you. Just give us a
I always laugh at these things because when you go to conferences, they give these amazing introductions with these huge titles as well, right? Like the cultural architect of the Western World Church. And you're like, oh, that sounds impressive. It means he's a pastor. So I basically pastor in downtown Hamilton. I moved to Canada 15 years ago for 1 year to marry a Canadian girl. She was at Redeem University. And then I kind of am still here. I moved 15 years ago for 1 year. I worked at Redeemer. I worked at a church in Waterdown called Grindstone Church. And about 5 years ago, we planted a church in downtown Hamilton. I have 3 children. Justin, who's here with me, he's 12. Benjamin, who's 9. And then Faith, who's our daughter, who's 7. Last summer, we just adopted Faith. So our family has been beautifully changed by having a girl in our family. And I talk about family because actually for me, that's been one of my learnings, the importance of family. I read an amazing quote the other day that said, I pray your ministry always flows from your home and not from your platform. And that was deeply challenging to me as a pastor, that how I live at home, how I interact with my children and my family, that sets up everything else. And I think sometimes as a pastor, it can be, how does my ministry look and how good do I look? But for me, one of my learnings is how do I be a good husband and a good dad? And so, yeah, and I love my community. We're this weird mix. In downtown Hamilton, we meet in an old German banquet hall. If anyone knows the Germania Club in Hamilton, we met there because there was nowhere else to meet in our neighborhood. And so it's not as great as this place. My friend Glenn laughed. A few years ago, we came when reunion was at Moonshine. And we walked in, it was a bar and a really cool place to meet. And my friend Glenn said, well, they don't have pictures of the Alps from the 70s, so because that's what we have, and we have weird German paraphernalia.
Yeah, so when our family has also visited St. Clair, I've spoken there 1 or 2 times, and once we went as a whole family, and it is like this German community center, and when you walk in, there's pictures of, I don't know if they're like founding members of this club, but like German men with small mustaches. And so we walked in, our son Silas said, oh, is this where Nazis hang out? Like he was a little bit freaked out by the paraphernalia all through there. Not that it is, but definitely not that it is, but it feels like a strange like warp in time when you walk in.
Oh yeah, the beautiful irony was standing up for the first week to preach as an Englishman in a German hall. So there's a bit of history there, but.
Okay, so we've been having, you know this, but we've been having this conversation on spiritual disciplines, different weeks talking about individual different disciplines. How have they been used in the church and the rhythm and life of the church over the centuries? And trying to figure out, could these be something that are important tools to help us then connect in a deeper level with Jesus? So just in a general way, before we jump into Sabbath, maybe just talk to us about spiritual disciplines, your experience or why you think it's important, just in a general sense, kind of your learnings with that.
I'm going to stress this pretty strongly, but I think the practices, that's what I would call them, these disciplines, these practices, for the church in our day, I don't think I can oversell it. Like, they're so important. We talk a lot in our community about the practices form us and shape us as disciples of Jesus. And I think our naivety is often, in the church we say, we're making disciples. The world is making disciples. We live in a culture that is discipling us all the time, every single day. So the challenge is, how am I being discipled by Jesus? And so when we talk about practices, almost to the point where my community is like, Matt, stop talking about this. But I think the practices are the things that form us and shape us. Dallas Willard, who's a bit of a hero of mine, says, the practices themselves aren't magical, like prayer, Sabbath, scripture reading, fasting, but the practices create the space for God to come and for his presence to come. And so that's just what I would say about the practices. Now, I grew up in the 70s. Well, I was born in the 70s, grew up also in the 80s, which was the best decade for film. Like, if anyone grew up in the 80s and watched 80s movies, they're the best. And so one of my favorite films ever was made in the 80s. I normally talk about this and give it a bit of a build-up, but my favorite film growing up in the 80s was The Karate Kid, like the original one. Daniel LaRusso. Basically, the premise, for those who don't know, not the Jaden Smith one, the original. Basically, Daniel...
The Ralph Macchio.
Oh, Ralph Macchio, I know. So he moves across the country with his mom. Basically, she gets a new job. He ends up going to this high school. He meets all these kids who are part of this dojo, Cobra Kai dojo, and they're all amazing at karate. Daniel gets bullied by this group, and basically He's having a terrible time in his life, and he meets the maintenance man, who happens to be a guy who makes bonsai trees and is also a karate grandmaster. So Mr. Miyagi, the maintenance guy, trains Daniel, and there's those amazing scenes where he gets him to paint his fence and wax his car, which are actually secretly karate moves. Who knew? So I think that's what my dad did afterwards. Oh, you should paint this fence, and he knew nothing about karate, but he just wanted me to do some housework. So basically, I watched this film, and this is what happened to me. I decided to go and get my bathrobe, the most Japanese-looking tea towel my mom had, wrap it around my head, go into my backyard, stand on a tree stump in the middle of England, and practice the crane technique, because I was so into the Karate Kid. But the reason was, I wanted to actually do what the Karate Kid did and be like him. And as I've reflected on my life, we often talk about Jesus and the way of Jesus, and I think we've given adherence to Jesus' teaching, but we've not actually asked, how do I actually live like Jesus and actually do what Jesus did? How do I adopt the lifestyle of Jesus? I have a quote that should be on the screen at some point. It's by a Persian lawyer, and his name is Payam Akvam, and my friend sent me this. It was at a Molson, I think it was a Molson lecture, or there was a lecture in Toronto. My friend went to it, and it says this: "The problem with the world is not a shortage of theories or feel-good slogans. The problem is that we confuse proliferation of progressive terminology with empathy and engagement. We say the right things, but we fail to act on them because we want to feel virtuous without paying a price." I live in a culture of rhetoric where we talk about stuff all the time. The media around us is really into talking about issues. I think the question for the people of God is, are we actually just going to do this thing? Are we actually going to step into it? But just to say, I had a really funny conversation with someone in my community. They were really mad at a certain political figure who's south of the border and his views on immigration. They were really mad. They were like, "Matt, what do you think about this? It's terrible." And I said, "Oh yeah, I wouldn't hold to his views on immigration." And she said, they were just railing on this leader. And so I just said, "Oh, you seem to really care about refugees." Yeah, it's so awful what he's saying." And I said, "So when was the last time you had a refugee over for dinner?" "No, you don't understand, Matt. He's a terrible person, and he keeps talking about how we should be welcoming to refugees." And I said, "Oh, I agree with you. What are you doing about that?" And so the practice is for me, in this way of following Jesus, I can talk a good game, but the question is, how am I actually living it out? And honestly, to paraphrase that quote, for me, it's I always have time for the things that are most important in my life.
It's great. So Sabbath then.
Yeah.
So if we zero in on Sabbath, so that, I just kind of used that intro story that there's this rhythm in my family of not doing certain fun things on Sunday. I had no context for why that was, other than you could get out of your Sunday clothes that you wore to church, but you can't really, you can do something as long as you're not sweating. That's how it almost felt like. You can play, but not really. And I never knew. But I think for my parents, they're trying to establish a sense of rhythm and Sabbath, of separation and space and rest, although I didn't have any context for it. Maybe for some of us, we know this idea of Sabbath, or we've heard the term, but what that really looks like could be, who knows for a lot of us. So can you just share your thoughts on Sabbath and what you've been learning as a community? I know you've been talking a lot about this over the last number of years, just for your crew at St. Clair.
Yeah, I think this sounds dramatic. Sabbath has changed my life, and I think saved my life in many ways. I grew up similar. In England, we had this thing where it's called no Sunday trading, where stores were closed on Sundays. So for the early part of my life, that's what life was like, which to me was, this is just terrible, because I can't go and get certain things on Sundays. And then I remember, as probably my early teens, they changed that, and so stores are open on Sundays, much to the horror of my parents and the church, and I just thought, this has got to be the best thing that has ever happened to England.
Yeah, it was like that here too. No Sunday shopping, and then when they were doing it, protests and freaking out and...
And I never understood that. I was like, this has just got to be great. This is like England moving into the future, progression. Not that we've ever been stuck in the past. And so I think that was part of so I didn't really get it. And similar, I just knew Sabbath was this day, basically a day off where you just didn't do fun things. And so one of the first times I ever preached a sermon in my life was at a university, and they were going through the Ten Commandments, and they asked me to speak on Sabbath. And even then, I did a load of research, and I don't know if I fully understood it. And yet over the last few years, it has so transformed my life. Sabbath, the original meaning of the word is from the Hebrew, which means Shabbat, which actually means just to cease or to stop. So in Hebrew understanding, Sabbath is just to stop. Pete Scazzero, I don't know if we have his quote, says this about Sabbath. The word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word that means to cease or to stop working. It refers to doing nothing related to work for a 24-hour period each week. It refers to this unit of time around which we're to orient our lives as holy. Sabbath provides us now the rhythm for an entire reorientation of our lives around the living God. On Sabbath, we imitate God by stopping our work and resting. I love that line, reorientation. Like Sabbath is a reorientation of how we live. And it's interesting because Sabbath is in the Ten Commandments. As I often said, Sabbath isn't a suggestion to the people of God, it's a command. And I think the reason is Israel are rescued out of Egypt. They're given the Ten Commandments, but their identity is slaves, right? They've been slaving for Pharaoh. And so when God rescues them, he says, here's how I want to form this nation, and here's how I want to teach you how to live. You need a day of rest, because your identity isn't producers. Your identity is beloved children of God who are image bearers. And again, this is an echo back to Genesis. It's interesting to me that Adam and Eve are created, and their first day after this initial creation, it says God rests. So in Adam and Eve's first day in the world is a day of rest. And I think what God is saying is we work from a place of rest, not rest from work. And that's really important. I mean, biblically and as Christians, we know this, but even just studies, right, like biological studies show we actually need rest and sleep. So even though I'm here looking at it from a biblical perspective, if you talk to anyone, you realize biologically we just actually need time to rest. And that's the rhythm that God placed in creation in the first place. And so for me, when we see that, I just think it's really important to understand it's what orients our life. And so I often say to our community, to have a really good theology of Sabbath, it also informs our theology of work and how work and rest go together. And so for me, it's changed my life because I just didn't used to live this way, and I realized something has to give. So.
Okay, so we want to, as long as we have enough time, open it up and see if people have comments or questions. But maybe just even practically, you said you think Sabbath keeping kind of changed and saved your life. What did that look like then? How and why? Like why was it so instrumental, and what does that look like for you now? Like what is your practice? What's your rhythm? And how did it save you?
Sabbath to me is totally connected to identity. It's all identity stuff. So often when we talk about this, I could sit here today and say, you should all Sabbath. And you're like, yeah, that totally sounds like a good thing. I can convince you. But the question is, will I actually go and Sabbath and do that? And so for me, it was connected to identity because I just used to work all the time. I just worked way too much, and I would feel tired and exhausted. And I think the reason I was working so much was, if I just try harder and be better and do more, then God will love me. If I just do more, if I try harder, then somehow by doing that, if my church gets bigger, if I see more people come to Jesus, then God will love me. And so I just worked way too much. And then in thinking about this, I was struck by the story of Jesus' baptism. You know, I mean, many of you know this, but Jesus is baptized, comes out of the Jordan, the voice, well, it's an amazing scene. The heavens open, whatever that is, and a voice speaks from heaven, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." And I was struck by the fact, at that point, Jesus has probably made a few tables, and done a little bit of woodworking here and there, not done any miracles, not started his ministry, and the voice says, "I love you because I love you, not because of what you do." And so to me, it was realizing, where is my identity? Is it in all these things I do, in trying harder, in trying to prove myself? or is it in who God sees me to be? And the other realization was, what does it say about me if I can't stop and rest, but God thinks he can? Right? So my friend said to me once, I was talking about this, I was debating, and it's like, oh, I'm really struggling, I'm doing too much. And he said, Matt, here's why Sabbath is so important. You're declaring to the world will continue quite fine without me, because God is holding it all together. So I'm saying, God, that's really great you took a rest, but I'm kind of a big deal. There's stuff to do. I have a lot going on. And so for me, it was this realization, as Scazzera says, by resting, we imitate God. And so if I want to follow Jesus, Father Gregory Boyle has one of my favorite quotes recently, we imitate the God we believe in. So how I live actually shows what I think about God and who he is. And so for me, it was this reminder, I'm trying to do all these things, but actually, do I trust God enough that he can hold these things without me always having to do them? And so the real tension point came when I actually had to ask the question, can I be a good father and a good pastor? So about 4 years ago, I think I nearly quit because I actually used to think, I don't know if I can. And it actually boiled down to Sabbath. Because I was trying to do all these things outside of my home. And like, oh, how do I do all these things? And for me, it just came to, if I learn to Sabbath and to rest well, and actually have rhythms of life, not just a 24-hour period, but rhythms of rest throughout my week. And so for me, I take 1 day a week for my Sabbath. It's my Friday, and the 2 words that Eugene Peterson, who I love, says about Sabbath is play and pray. So time to refresh myself with God, but also just doing things that bring me life. That's what my Sabbath is for. So nothing productive. So I shut down my email. I try and turn off my phone so my community can't get a hold of me. And I just take a 24-hour period off. But also during the week, how do I have moments of rest? Because if you're listening to this, depending on where you're at in life, if you're a mom with like loads of kids and me saying Sabbath, like, must be nice. You know, I have people say that to me. So I think it's not prescriptive, like, everyone do the same thing all of the time. But actually, the question is, do we have moments of rest in our week where we're not producing something or consuming something?
Yeah, that working from a place of rest rather than resting from work. So I think we all know, like, we've heard people talk before about, oh, you can be more productive if you're well rested, like you just produce, you're more efficient, it's actually better. Like we can understand that maybe in theory, but then putting that into practice, I mean, for me, that's definitely a struggle for me. I fully, this is one of my biggest struggles is I wrap identity into doing and getting things done, and that gives me a sense of accomplishment. And that in and of itself isn't a bad thing, but when that is what's driving, or a fear of letting people down, can be a real struggle for me too. When you take a break, then you feel guilty for taking some space.
Walter Brueggemann says, it's one of my favorite quotes on Sabbath, rested people are dangerous people. Because we live in a world of consuming and producing. So how can you be creative when you're exhausted? And yet the Genesis account says God he makes us his image bearers to be creative in the world. And that was the other thing. I realized I have no space for creativity when I'm exhausted.
No, I used to, I don't know if you still do it, but Matt used to post either Thursday night or Friday morning. At some point, I always used to see it come up in my feed, and you would put a quote about Sabbath or something, almost to remind everyone, if you can't get a hold of me, this is why. But maybe I'm reading too much into it. Maybe also to remind yourself to stop. Like, by posting it, you're making it like people are going to wonder if you're now calling and sending emails, if you're like, I thought you said you were taking a Sabbath today. Almost to get you going in that rhythm yourself.
You cannot, the spiritual practices we cannot do by ourselves. I'm convinced of that. We've made them an individualistic thing, right? How's your prayer time, and how's your scripture reading? How's your Sabbath? But they were always meant to be done in community. So there's an individual element, but the reason I used to post was so people could ask me if I was doing it. And so I used to post to help people think, and as a pastor, here's the other thing. If I'm not, what does that say to my community? I don't have time to rest, but you totally should rest. The integrity is, I'm doing this, you have permission to do it, and I'll also let you know when I'm doing it so you could speak to me about it. Because for a long time, I used to try and attempt it, and if I didn't tell anyone, that I could kind of get away with it and look at email and do different things. In fact, it was great, because early on when I started to do it, people would message me back saying, why are you sending me this email? It's a Friday. It's like, because they just called me on it. And so that was also helpful, but I had to do it for accountability, because I think we have to do these things in community.
Yeah, it's interesting, because if we knew there was a leader, like say a pastor, spiritual leader who never prayed, never studied, any of those things, we'd be like, wait, what's going on? But certain other ones, like say fasting or Sabbath, certain ones were like, do you really think that's important? You know what I mean? Like we evaluate for ourselves which ones should be part of our rhythm, and then maybe which ones aren't so important. We're kind of self-selective on those ones.
Oh, I think we've totally done that. Reading the Bible and praying are like front and center, right? But actually, I always ask, for our current context in the world in which we live, which are not more important, but which do we need to press into? And in our day, Sabbath is essential. Eugene Peterson a few years ago said something that kind of bothered me, because I'm still wondering if I agree with it. But he said, we talk about sharing our faith with people, and the old term is like evangelism, like talking to people about Jesus. And he said, before we evangelize people, we've got to Sabbath people. Because what people hear in our culture is, add Jesus on the top of my already busy life. So it's kind of an addendum on my life. But actually, Jesus wants to come and reorient everything back to him. So we actually need space to walk with Jesus. And so, yeah, for me, in our world, in my community too, this is one of the things I keep drumming into people. Because actually, if you're in a culture that is just constantly busy and exhausted, if you start practicing Sabbath, people notice. People ask me, like, oh, you just seem to be having a day where you're not really doing a lot. Yeah, this is my Sabbath. I have neighbors who don't know Jesus who that's one of the things they want to talk about, because they don't quite get it. Because they're like, I'm so tired and busy, and you seem to have time at home, just relaxing. And so, yeah, I think it's actually, for us today, really important and deeply formative.
That's good. Let's just pause here for a sec. Any comments, questions, thoughts you guys want to throw out or ask Matt?
Disagreements. They're always good.
Any thoughts, ideas? Yeah, Aaron.
I have a question. So you said pray and play was your phrase. At what point does play come into like consumerism, like say video games or Netflix? Does that count for personal rest and relaxation? Or is that more on the consumerism side and we should avoid that?
That is that's some of my notes. That's so good, because that's really, really important. A friend to me, when I was talking about Sabbath, said, what's the difference between rest and escape? Which is a really key thing. I love that. So am I resting, or am I escaping? Many of you may have heard of Brené Brown. She talks a lot about vulnerability and shame. She has an interesting thing. She says, most people in our culture struggle with shame, and the 3 responses to shame are hiding, numbing, and blaming. And so a lot of the time, are we resting or just numbing ourselves because we're so tired? So I would say the things that bring me life, that aren't just an escape from the things I have to face. So I would say to some people, a show on Netflix, because they're not always on Netflix, is totally fine. But I think, so I won't prescribe you should all do the same thing, but the practices on our Sabbath, I think, are really important. Because often, I think people spend 8 hours on Netflix because they're so tired from their week, and then they wonder why they're tired again the next week. So if you're, for Sabbath almost, if you're constantly on that as a way to unwind in the evening, maybe on a Sabbath not doing it would be important. Like go for a walk, get outside, do something that brings life. So, but I think that's a really important distinction that I think we've often lost, because a day off isn't a Sabbath. I think I'd want to make that distinction. I think they're quite different, because we can just have a day off, which is basically catch up on everything I didn't get to the rest of the week. I think in the understanding of the scripture, a Sabbath is a day, I think in Exodus it says God refreshed himself somehow by resting. So what does it do to refresh ourselves? And part of the play bit for me is just spending time with God. I think Sabbath has really helped me figure out, how do I practice the presence of God in my daily life? To me, maybe that's what Sabbath is.
So it's not about checking out then. It's not when you're just addressing this. So it's not about just like doing something where you just turn everything off. There's still an engagement. Like there's an active part of that as you're praying and playing. Because if I'm understanding what your thoughts are right, if you're doing something that's just like 8 hours pass and all of a sudden you're like, oh, what did I do? I just watched this whole season of this show. Rather than you're saying rest still has some element of engagement to it.
Yeah, because I think rest, again, is tied to creativity. So to me, rest is actually somehow being present and more in tune with the world around me. So I think escape is, I want to shut off these things that I need to be present to in my life. I think for me, Sabbath has really allowed me to think through, how do I be present to God and present to another person? And actually, most of the time, I'm distracted. See, I honestly think one of the greatest threats to Christianity in our day, in Western culture, is this thing. Like, I know that might seem like...
You got a new phone.
I did. And I need
Your
to get
flip phone's gone. Matt's had the oldest phone since I've known him. Wow.
Actually, I went in with my old phone, and I said, as a joke, I said to the guy, what can I trade this in for? And he went, I have not seen one of those for a long time. So... But for me, honestly, I think it seems overdramatic, but I think it's true. Distraction and busyness are two of the greatest challenges. And so how can I be present to God when I'm always distracted? And so for me, it's being present, and that's what Sabbath allows me to do. Jesus is so annoyingly present all of the time. Like there's a story when Jesus heals the woman who's bleeding internally. She reaches out. But it actually says Jesus is on his way through Jericho somewhere else. And he stops and is amazingly present. And honestly, most of the time, it's hard to be present to what God is doing in my life because I'm always thinking of something else and trying to be somewhere else. Just a funny story. I talked about this recently in our community. Like, we got to be present and pay attention. And that evening, just as I was going out to a church function, my neighbor showed up on my doorstep. And I was actually holding food. And they wanted to talk to me about their life. And I had that moment, I was like, I'm way too busy. I've got these other things to do. Fortunately, I'm a better pastor than I used to be. So I stopped and spent a bunch of time talking to them. But I think Sabbath really allows me to say, how do I be present at every moment? Because as maybe Jacob says in Genesis, surely God was in this place, but I actually didn't even recognize it. So,
another thought, question, idea. Yeah, Heather? Or both, either Heather.
Do you have any insight into how to bring the idea of Sabbath into family dynamics and how to balance the personal Sabbath versus teaching that to your kids?
Oh yeah. This probably most of my answers have been rambled, so this may be rambled, but I think this is really. It is a family thing, not just a personal thing. Because as I shared at the start, for me, I think for a few years, ministry life, being a pastor, was actually completely separated from my family life. And so in England, we have this phrase, an Englishman's home is his castle. So it was like I would come home, close the drawbridge, and like now it was like family life. And for me, I keep asking the question, how does my family life bleed into the rest of my life? And so for us as a family, we're trying to figure out with our children, how do we have rhythm? So actually some involves screens for our kids. Like, there's a lot of stuff around screen time, but for us, we're pretty strict on those things. And so today is go outside and be creative and actually enjoy the world around you. Or my wife's much better than me, but we'll do crafts or certain things with our kids that aren't just being on screens for that day. And also, recently, my wife's been on a maternity leave because we adopted our daughter, but she's going back to work. She does work full-time as a social worker. And so for us, we're also trying to integrate, I think, Sabbath in our weekly rhythm, not just in a day, because there is a 24-hour period, but for us, it's like, where does rest flow throughout the week? Because for my wife and I, we don't have the same Sabbath as well. Like, she works different hours. So we're trying to work out with our family, where do we have periods of rest? So some of it, honestly, is just not over-programming our lives. Like, I know that's kind of can be a cultural idol, right? This idea of like busyness and we need to put our kids in everything all the time. For us, we just choose a couple of things that they're involved in because we want to have times of rest, because even our home is more open than it used to be. So children will come over and play with our kids a bunch in our house, and we're trying to continue to encourage that. So we're not always going out to do something else. And so throughout the week, how do we have periods of rest and say to our kids, hey, it's not just about going to do something, but it's even being together as we do them. But I feel like it's a really important question because for us, it has to involve my children and what I'm modeling to them. So,
Heather, yeah, go for it.
So for those of us who like work and then also come to church and volunteer and sort of, especially in like a small community, church, Sundays are a natural sort of Sabbath day. But if you're a volunteer and you're in a small community where there's a small amount of people who do a lot of the work, how do you talk about church being work, and where did those kinds of people sort of build in the Sabbath? Because it's really hard for those of us who work Monday to Friday, like a pastor who would say, oh, I can take Friday off, but I still work Sunday. Sunday is my job and I work that day. So how do we do that with like volunteers and people who maybe sometimes feel like church is more work and not necessarily restful and enjoyable?
Matt? No, like,
Expose our church.
no, that is, we've been there, we planted. And so, you know, the joke is when there's 20 or 30 of you, everyone has to do something, right? That's the joke. There's no getting out here. No one can hide in the back and just show up. And so I think some of it for me is figuring out as a pastor, how do I have integrity and call people to things that I'm also going to do as well? But that's on the flip side. Because I often say, oh man, 98% of my community aren't in a pastoral ministry role. Every day faithfully following Jesus in their workplace. And so I think even have a healthy understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus in our workplaces. As pastors, we need to remember that. So for a while, I actually just showed up to people's workplaces and tried to hear their stories of like what their lives were like. And then I think, I don't have an easy answer, but I think for us is just not over-programming a bunch of church activity as well. So we're going to ask people to do just a few things. So we don't run a lot of programs. And also the reiteration that we talk a lot about family in our community. And so in family, everyone has to pitch in and help out. So continuing to re-emphasize, for us maybe because as we've grown, we keep trying to remind people it's not okay for like 20% of the people to do 80% of the work. That's not how we work. That's not how we function in our community. So how do other people step in and help out and just not be scheduled as much? And so we also one thing we've tried to do is every so often we just shut down our Sunday gathering as well to give people space. So how do we not make Sundays more and more work for people? That's maybe not the best answer, but I think it's something that we just try not to spend so much time on a Sunday doing a whole lot of stuff. I think that's the thing. At Sunday gatherings, we say a lightweight and low maintenance. So it's going to take like 5 hours to set up. That's just not helpful for the people in our community.
We could obviously keep talking about this for a long time. Just for the sake of time, what have been some practical things that you've tried, or people in your crew have tried to start stepping into this? Maybe each time we talk about a different discipline, we've tried to give practical suggestions so that it doesn't feel like they're jumping right into the deep end, even with prayer or solitude, like just small steps to start exploring the discipline. So for some people, the idea of a 24-hour space may feel like, well, it may seem wonderful, but how would you even do that? So what are some steps and ways we can explore, and then we can talk about it around our midweek tables, but what have you learned, and what would you suggest to us along this theme?
I wanted to share this story, so I'm just going to share this really briefly, because this was probably the thing about 8 to 10 years ago when I heard this that started my journey, I think of Sabbath. So John Ortberg is a pretty well-known author, and he ended up years ago getting a job at Willow Creek, which I think at the time was like the biggest church in North America. It's huge. So he phoned his mentor, Dallas Willard, and he said to Dallas Willard, I've taken on this role in this church. How do I maintain my spiritual life while I've got all of these responsibilities? And he said, Dallas Willard paused, as he always did, and he said, you must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life. And John Orbeck says he wrote that down. He's like, that's really good. Like, what's next? And Dallas Willard said, there is nothing else. Totally Yoda style. That's how Dallas Willard works. But I think that was it for me. Like, I must ruthlessly eliminate hurry. So one of the practical things is just looking at my week and my schedule. I think our calendar's a spiritual thing. So for me, it was just looking at my calendar and asking, where's my Sabbath? Again, for me, maybe it was easier as a pastor. But in my week, where are my rhythms of just resting or not having to produce something? This might sound really funny. Playing Lego with my kids has been one of the greatest spiritual practices. And here's why. They never asked me about the church. They honestly can't. They've never said to me, Dad, how many people showed up? How are the offerings going? Are you getting any speaking gigs? You know, they just don't care. They're like, Dad, build this really difficult thing that I found online 2 days ago. So Lego for me, and also it's a time where I can be present, and my identity is I'm with my kids and I understand the Father. So just having those rhythms with my kids. One practical thing, and this is how I start my day. I get up at 6 every day before my kids get up. I stumble downstairs, I make my coffee. I go to sit on my couch. I pull this old man blanket over myself because I'm getting really old. I watch all the people jogging up and down my street, thinking that must be nice. Unlucky for them, especially in the winter. And I sip on my coffee, and then I start my day with 10 minutes of silence, which you had a spiritual director here last week. That's what they said to me. I said, give me some advice. I need to figure out how to have a balanced life. And they said, Matt, start every day with 10 minutes of silence. This is not a joke. But I used to do this, sit on my couch. I'd have my phone on the table next to me, trying to do my 10 minutes of silence, and I would open my eye, click my iPhone, and it was like a minute and a half in. And then I would Google how to have 10 minutes of silence, which is ridiculous. So I then put my phone in a drawer in another room because I was so distracted by it. And here's why. Henry Nouwen says we have to be quiet to hear the voice of the one who calls us beloved. So my practice is I sit there, I open my hands like this on my couch, and I say this prayer. God, I thank you, I'm your beloved, and I awake into a world that I did not create. And that's how I start every single day. Drink my coffee, then I'll pray, sometimes I'll read the scripture. But that's actually just a practice I've had because I want to build a Sabbath rhythm in. And then at different points, what's funny to me is how church history comes back around. So all these practices throughout the day, the daily office or the times of prayer during the day are things that I have. So that's my morning at lunchtime. I pause, even on have a little reminder just for a couple of minutes. And that time in my day, I just pray, God, would your kingdom come and your will be done in my life and in Hamilton as it is in heaven. Just a reminder that God is at work all around me. And then in the evening, I do something called the Examine, which is a prayer practice where I come before God, I read the psalm, God, you have searched me and you know me. And at the end it says, know my anxious thoughts. If there's any offensive way in me, forgive me and lead me in the way everlasting. So I just kind of bring my day before God. And so that's like a daily rhythm because I realized I need to practice God's presence throughout my day. And then on my Sabbath, practically, I try and just do things that bring life. I'll try and, if my wife was off work, I'll go for lunch with her. I'll try and spend some time praying or reading a book. But I have other friends, again, I don't want to be prescriptive maybe for Sabbath, because I have other friends who do different things, but it's that idea of being refreshed.
I think it's Bob Goff. I think he says, I don't know if he says every day, but he says, I think Bob Goff says, I quit something every week. I think that's his line. Have you heard him say that? Like when he's talking about eliminating hurry and pressure, he has this thing where I try to quit something. I think it's him who says that. I try to quit something every week, thereby freeing up space to be present and be available for something that's unexpected or just to simply be. And I think maybe for some of us, even the first step is I got to look practically at all the things I've said yes to, and I have to learn how to say no, even if it means letting someone else down by saying no.
Yeah, we're in a season of Lent, right? Like we're practicing Lent in our community, and Lent is, stopping something and picking something up. But my question was, what do we need to let go of? I say no to certain things so I can say yes to who God is. And to tie this in, I took a sabbatical last summer, and I was on my sabbatical, and one day I was praying, and I often have dialogue with God. That's how my prayers go. And I felt God say to me, Matt, do you think you can sustain the next 10 years the way you did the last 10? All God's questions are rhetorical. That was my learning from sabbatical. And of course I was like, oh, no. And I realized I'd lived on adrenaline and like trying harder, but actually in 10 years' time I'll be burnt out. So the question is, who do I just want to be? Because I think we're called to imitate the God we believe in. And so for me, it was just looking at my schedule. When I came back after sabbatical, I just actually had to ruthlessly cut some things that maybe were even good, but they weren't the best.
Matt, it's been a great conversation. For the sake of time, we're not going to close by singing, and we're not going to have communion together today just because of time, and I just felt like having more space for this conversation is really important.
Have I caused problems with the stuff you're meant to do?
Huge problems. Black Panther will now be delayed, or whatever's in here. No, it's totally fine. It's really good conversation. I know this is a really important topic and things to explore, and also a really difficult one. We often find it, we'll talk about prayer or scripture study or silence and solitude, and maybe that feels more normative, even just discussing it. And Sabbath is one of those ones that feels, we know it's important, but we're not sure why, and we know we should figure out ways of incorporating it, but we're not really sure how. So thanks for being here. Maybe what we can do is let's just be quiet for a moment, and then I'll just close in prayer. And then Matt's around if you want to chat with him, ask him any questions or anything. But thank you for giving us some of your time.
That was a pleasure. Just to say, I've talked way too much. You have a great community. I normally try and my humor's always sarcastic because I'm English, and so I banter with Matt a lot, but you have a great community. We've journeyed alongside you, and you have a wonderful pastor. And so it's just been a privilege to be here. I've met a lot of pastors in the last 10 plus years in full-time congregational ministry, and definitely Vincent's up there with the best of them. So it's just been a privilege to be here.
All right. Thanks, Maddie. So let's just take a moment to be quiet, and then I'll just close this up. Father, we began this whole series a couple months ago talking about that passage in John 15, talking about remaining and abiding. Jesus, that you're the vine, we're the branches. And that idea of remaining sounds so sweet in some ways, of just resting and finding space and identity in you. But we do admit that it's so difficult, and our tendency is to try to work harder and produce more and seek our value and identity in the affirmation and applause of other people. And when we keep going in that direction, it pulls us further from the true source of life and identity. And so even in this conversation on Sabbath, I guess I'm just mindful of how easy it is for me to forget and to tip in the wrong direction. And God, I think it's maybe something we need to continue to talk about honestly with each other. In our culture, in a world here that is so driven by success and performance and meeting goals, it can be really easy to think that those are the things that are most important and the things that we need to give our whole life to. And in and of themselves, none of those things are wrong, but it can lead us in a way of forgetting and not tuning in and not attaching ourselves to you. So God, teach us what it means. Help us to take small steps of resting and abiding, of being present with our family, with our friends, with the things that give us real life, to stop and to pray and to play. And I think it's really important for us to figure this out. And as Matt shared, by doing those things, that our culture will be curious. People will be curious. Why are you doing these things? Why do you prioritize these things? That we be a culture that stands apart, a community that looks different as we, Jesus, follow your rhythms and your practices, and we model a life after you. So thanks for Matt and the St. Clair community. We just pray for them. We're so grateful for the chance to learn from them. They teach us so much, and they are doing such amazing things in the city. Hamilton, we pray blessing and encouragement on them, for Matt and his leaders and the crew there as they model and live and welcome people around the table, following and inviting others to follow Jesus for the first time. Thanks for these moments just to learn together, to be refreshed, and to spend time together, even now as we hang out and clean up. God, thanks for being here and being present by your Spirit. Amen.